So our first article will be presented by Kim Whitler of the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia and Ryan Krause from Texas Christian University. They're going to share some really interesting insights from their article examining the impact of board members with marketing experience on firm growth outcomes. Thank you for joining us, Kim and Ryan.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.
We are excited to be here to talk about our research, which is really an investigation of the impact of marketers on the board of directors. And this is the first research that's really asked a central question: do marketers matter at the board? Now, our interest in this topic really emanated from a contradiction that we noticed in practice. And I want to share some facts that really highlight this contradiction. At the very top of the firm, a key question is, what is it that they're grappling with? What are the big challenges that they're trying to deal with? And there's been some interesting research from PwC over the last 2 years that indicates the top issue that boards care about right now is how do they assemble the right composition? In other words, how do they get a team of 9 to 10 who can effectively steward and govern the firm? Who are the right individuals to include on the board so that they can help the CEO and top management team achieve the objectives for the firm? So right below the board are CEOs and the management team, top management team. And so we also wanted to understand, well, what are their big strategic priorities? Because this is what boards should be helping them with. The number one top priority, according to Gartner, is growth. Board CEOs and top management teams are challenged to drive growth. And among the other 9 top strategic priorities, 3 are also centrally focused on marketing: the customer, innovation, and sales. Now, of the remaining bubbles on this chart, many of these strategic priorities are shared by marketing with other functions. So corporate development, management, efficiency and productivity, workforce issues, all of these are shared across multiple functions. But what's interesting here is that at the top of the list of priorities the CEOs and top management teams are focused on is trying to figure out how to generate growth. And we can see that this isn't unique to one industry. Here are just some headlines from the past year of companies across industries, from CPG, General Mills, to 3M, to even tech, where they're struggling to figure out how to generate growth. In fact, just this week, we saw for the first time in over a century that GE replaced their internal CEO with a former CEO of Danaher because GE's struggling to generate growth. So growth is a top priority at the top of the firm. So we then think if growth and marketing related problems are challenges at the top of the firm, that marketing might be actually valued on the board of directors in order to provide advice and guidance to the top management team. And so we looked at some research. This is from the NACD, where they asked corporate directors, board members themselves, how important are different types of experience on the board. 47% indicated that finance experience is very important on the board, but only 4% indicated that marketing experience is very important. Consistent with this belief, if you actually look at Fortune 1000 board seats, less than 0.5% are actual currently marketers. So this is research conducted by Spencer Stuart, where they found that less than 0.5% are currently active CMOs. So what we see here, if you pull all this together, is that on the one hand, boards and CEOs and top management teams are struggling with marketing-related problems, but on the other hand, they don't seem to see any value in having marketing expertise on the board. And this is centrally our question. Are, in fact, boards correct? Is marketing experience on the board important, or from their perspective, it's not important? And here I have 2 examples of marketing experienced board members. Rob Malcolm is the former president and global marketing, sales, and innovation officer for Diageo, and he's currently a board member on Hershey's board. Beth Comstock is formerly the SVP and CMO of GE. She's currently a board member of Nike. So boards essentially don't believe that this type of experience is valuable above and beyond the other board members that exist, and this is our question. Is it valuable? And if it is, when is it most valuable? What are some of the circumstances where it matters most? And so the very first question is, if marketers on the board have an impact, what is it that they might impact? What would be the firm outcome that marketing expertise at the board would help facilitate? And our answer, as you could probably guess, is that it's revenue growth. We believe that when you have marketing experts on the board, they bring a different paradigm and expertise than do most of the inwardly throughput-oriented functions that currently populate boards. So many of the individuals on boards have accounting, finance, operations type background. Those backgrounds tend to focus on efficiency and throughput, while marketing and sales tends to focus on demand generation and output. And so when you add a marketer or salesperson to the board, we believe that what you're going to have is greater expertise that will enable better governance of the demand generating efforts within the company. And so ultimately you'll get better revenue growth. With that, I'll turn it over to Ryan, who will talk a little bit about the research.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, so to ascertain which board members had marketing experience, we collected and coded over 64,000 board member biographies from corporate proxy statements and coded them for whether a director had marketing experience or not. On the next slide here, you can see an example. So this is an example of a director who has executive level marketing experience, which is what we look for, things like executive vice president, strategy, and marketing. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the data. So overall did find that boards with marketers among their members experienced higher revenue growth. Specifically, they had about almost 6 percentage points higher revenue growth in the subsequent year on average. So really pretty significant increase in revenue growth. And so, then we also looked at what factors might influence the degree to which marketers actually have this effect on revenue growth. And so we found basically 3 sets of factors that make marketers more or less influential on revenue growth. The first one we call situational influence factors, which are basically things we say when the firm is in a situation where growth is more of a challenge, the rest of the board is going to seek out the expertise of marketers. And so we identified that when a firm is in an industry with weak growth, or the firm itself has had weak market share growth in the past, then the influence of marketers on the board is going to be greater. We also identified what we call dispositional influence factors. This is the specific attributes of the other board members themselves, that there are some people who are more or less likely to listen to marketers. And so we found that marketers tend to have the greatest influence on the board when there are fewer CFOs among the board members, and when there are more marketing interlocks. That's when the members of the board are on other boards where there are marketers, right? So they're more primed to listen to marketers because they have prior experience in that same context listening to marketers. And then finally, what we call structural influence factors. These are aspects of the board. It's in terms of its structure. We found that the effect of marketers on revenue growth seems to be higher when the CEO is also chairman of the board. And we think this has something to do with the fact that there's a greater connection and greater communication between the board and the top management team because of this connection. And as a result, the influence of marketers on the board is more likely to make its way into top management team decision making.
Terrific. So to share with you a very simple kind of model-free illustration of how this works, let's go back in time to 2008 and 2009 when we had the economic collapse. And what we did is we just looked at all the data in our database. We looked at all the firms, and we looked at from 2008 to 2009 what the average revenue change of all the firms was. And then we looked at all, total firms, boards with marketers, and boards without marketers. And what's interesting is that you can see across all firms, on average, revenue declined 6% from 2008 to 2009, but with boards with marketers on them, it actually increased 2%, and boards without marketers declined by 8%. So we think this is a powerful illustration of the impact that having marketing expertise at the board level can have on firm revenue growth. So what does this mean then as we conclude? I just want to highlight 3 different areas where we think that this has important ramifications for practice. First, boards themselves. So we started this presentation by talking about how important marketing-related problems are to those at the top, and yet boards themselves don't believe or behave as if marketing expertise can lend insight into those challenges. We believe that this empirical evidence suggests that boards should reconsider their current practice of excluding marketers, and it helps identify conditions under which boards will be more, where marketers will be even more useful to boards. The second implication from this research is for executive recruiters. And executive recruiters are actually the gatekeepers that largely help identify the slate of candidates that they then hand to boards to consider. And so it's critical that executive recruiters understand this data and this research. We believe that with this evidence, they now can do a better job of helping educate boards on when marketing expertise is of value and actually identify appropriate candidates that they can bring to the nominating committee. And lastly, this one may be less obvious, but in fact, this research has implications for CMOs. I've spoken to a number of CMOs, and most largely do not consider who sits on the board. And yet this research suggests that they should be looking up and understanding what allies they have on the board who can help them implement the CMO's growth agenda. So if there is a marketer on the board, this research suggests that CMO may more likely have an ally, a champion, who can help the board understand the CMO's growth agenda and help get that implemented. So thank you all for your time today, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Kim and Ryan. That was very interesting. And we have one kind of clarification question and then a couple of other kind of strategic questions. So Boz has asked about your illustration involving the recession. He says, but 2008, 2009 was the depth of the recession, concerns about macro effects on revenue growth. Did you adjust for GDP growth in your analysis?
Yeah, I mean, so that example was just sort of a specific data point we wanted to bring out. I mean, that's kind of the point of the example, is that this was a time when there was significant downward pressure on revenue growth across companies, but that the firms with marketers on the board did not experience that same decline, and in fact continued to experience mild revenue growth. So that was the point. That was not a we didn't model that. That was not a formal test of anything. So if were we to do that, yeah, we would incorporate that.
So Charles asks, what makes boards exclude marketers? Is it because of the belief that marketing is not important, or are there other reasons, do you think?
Terrific question, Charles. Thanks for that question. We didn't necessarily directly study this. However, we do have a couple of we have some insight, we believe, about what's driving this. The first thing is that there's regulation post-SOX back in the early 2000s, that started mandating that all boards, all public boards, have finance experts. And so what you see from the late 90s to the mid-2000s was that there was a shift in the number of finance experts that were on boards. On top of it, because of the higher accountability that board members have to have post-SOX, you started seeing a shrinking in the size of boards. So you now have two factors, a smaller board size and more finance experts, that started kind of shifting the composition of boards. Concurrently, we also have some research that's been done by some folks in management that indicates that even board members have in-group bias. And what that means is that we all tend to prefer people like ourselves. And there's been research among board members that indicates that they have functional bias. So if I'm a finance person, I tend to, prefer finance folks because we speak the same language, decision making, we have the same paradigm, decision making can be faster. And so what's happened is that you have some regulatory pressure that's kind of shifted the board composition, frankly, away from some of these other functional expertise areas, at the same time that we know that board members behave like the rest of us, and that they tend to have some in-group bias. And so because marketers tend not to exist on boards, it then becomes very challenging to get marketers on boards unless there's some sort of external exogenous impetus that helps the board understand that they need marketing expertise. And we're starting to see this, by the way, Charles, with companies wanting digital expertise. And so that's one pathway through which marketers are getting onto boards because they're trying to disrupt their firm from a digital perspective, and they need some expertise at the board level. And so that's one path that marketers are using to get onto boards.
Very interesting. There's a question here about, have you guys continued to collect data into the present period, say from the last 4 or 5 years? And also, do you have you looked at the difference between paid versus volunteer boards? I think most of your boards will be paid positions, but and then also small versus mid-sized companies. Some of those nuances. Could you just share a little bit more of that detail?
Yeah, so they are all paid. These are all large publicly traded companies. So with very few exceptions, the directors are all going to be compensated. I think the point about small firms is a really great idea and a great point, because we looked at large firms, and I think it's an open question whether these results would still hold or possibly be stronger with small firms. I mean, when you think about which company's growth is most imperative for. I mean, large companies can kind of amble along with mediocre growth for a while. For small firms, it's incredibly imperative, and so I would guess that the effects would be even stronger for small firms. And we are in the process of collecting more recent data to answer that question.
Got it. And one of the questions that I had was, so you identify some of these conditions when marketers are more or less valuable. Do you have any insight on exactly how marketers do influence the board and the top management team? So if a marketer is successful, what are some of the insights that you might have about how they actually accomplish this?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Because of it, because of many of the reviewers' comments, what we ended up doing in the process of working on this research is we went and interviewed 22 different board members, some of which had marketing expertise, some of which didn't, to try to understand one key question. How is it that one individual on a board of 9 or 10 could actually influence the entire performance of a firm? Because it seems at one level to be somewhat of an outrageous claim, right? One individual at the board could have such an effect on the firm. And what we found actually was quite interesting relative to a lot of the research that's been done, because there's really a bit of an assumption that members on the board historically play this kind of oversight role. They're not very engaged necessarily in strategy, and they're definitely not engaged in operations. But what we found is something quite different. In fact, the individuals that we interviewed indicated that they affected the firm through two different mechanisms. One is through meetings themselves, inside of the meetings, and I'll talk about that in a second. The second is actually outside of meetings, in direct contact with board members, the CEO, and in many cases, the top management team. And this was fascinating for us. So within within the meetings, individuals indicated that that one marketer can influence the agenda, what topics are discussed, what topics aren't discussed. They can affect the amount of time spent on each of those topics. They can potentially affect who actually attends those meetings. So if you have a marketer on the board, they're going to be more likely to want to hear from the CMO on the top management team about specific issues. So they can actually affect who attends from the top management team. And then obviously they can affect discussions themselves. What questions are asked, what trends are brought to bear, what external data is shared. In one case, we had somebody talk about how she brought up questions that the top management team couldn't answer, and that what ultimately happened was that they hired an outside consulting firm that she recommended, because she had expertise in the area, to come in and help advise the top management team. So the other thing, and the most surprising thing that we found in these interviews, is how much the board members were engaged in helping the top management team. A number of them actually were asked to go down and to either serve on ad hoc committees, to lead those committees, but to somehow engage directly with the CMO and the marketing apparatus. We were not expecting that, and that was quite surprising. One of the interviewees made the following comment. They said that in today's progressive board environment, and this individual happened to sit on a number of Fortune 100 firm boards. They said, in this progressive board environment, boards needed to generate an ROI themselves, that they're not just there to provide oversight, but in fact, they have to provide value that helps have impact for the firm. And so this very kind of activist board thinking was something that we weren't expecting, that surprised us.
Well, that's really helpful to hear about the interviews too. And we had questions about being able to access the article, which should be available on the Journal of Marketing website. And there will be, after the session today, we'll post also a kind of a manager-friendly version of the article, which will drop out a lot of the statistics and things that you'll also be able to access. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. One technical question from PK. So he asks, could there be an external factor that leads to both revenue growth being important and having marketers on the board? So he's asking you basically to rule out this maybe a third factor that could be influencing both of these. Did you look at that in your article?
Yeah, that is always a concern when you're using a correlational study like this. You're using data that you didn't create through a laboratory experiment or something. And in the paper we try to control for other factors that might be doing this, that might be explaining the results. And there are some statistical techniques that we use to try and rule this out. But it's always a concern. I think the biggest concern is not so much that there's some sort of random variable that might be causing both these things to co-occur. I think it's more that the biggest challenge here is that that directors with marketing experience may be chosen as part of a broader firm level initiative to drive growth, right? And so while we try to control for other aspects of that kind of initiative, there's always that risk that this is a strategic choice on the part of the firm. And this is always a challenge when you're studying strategy of any kind, because when you're looking at performance effects, strategy is inherently endogenous in that a strategy is always chosen in order to improve performance, theoretically, right? So trying to tease out was it chosen randomly or not is pretty difficult and somewhat questionable. So yeah, we did perform a number of statistical techniques to try and get around that, but at the same time, this is always a concern when you're doing correlational studies like this.
Thanks, Ryan. And I having looked at the article, I think you did a terrific job trying to deal with those other factors. So I think folks can also look at the paper to see some of the sort of nitty-gritty details that you've described in general terms. So I think we have a couple more minutes. Would you like to leave the group that's with us today with any final thoughts on marketing experience board members?
There's one last question, maybe this would be a good one to kind of close it out. And the question was from Patrick, who asked, could we clarify how marketers on boards interact with CMOs or other marketing leadership or staff? Do they inadvertently create added pressure? And that's an interesting question, because as part of the interviews, I actually talked with 3 board members, including the CEO from one firm, and I also talked with the CMO and the former CMO from that firm. So this is kind of a deep dive to try to understand from multiple different perspectives what's going on, how do marketing board members have an effect. And to answer your question directly, in some cases, if they're overly involved, and this is part of a board member's challenge, is to ride that fine line. If they're overly involved, they can exert undue pressure on the CMO and the marketing function, especially if the board member does not think that they're performing well, right? So this is when their expertise might be used to help counsel, in some cases, the CEO toward the hiring of a new CMO. But in many cases, what we found is that the board members are there to try to help support and champion marketing. I can give you another example where a marketer came forward with a proposal. There was no way for them to get, the CMO came forward to the board with a very large financial proposal, no way to get any clear data on the results of the investment, but the board member was able to help the board see the strategic value in making this investment. And because of that championing, the board ended up saying yes, and it ended up being one of the most important growth drivers of their firm over a decade period. So without the board member, the CMO would not have been able to get the approval from the board. That champion was able to support it. And so, kind of the short answer here is that I'd say it depends on the circumstances. If the marketing team is struggling, then it could be that the board member hastens the exit of the CMO by helping the board understand that perhaps they don't have the right talent or putting pressure on them. On the flip side, the board member can be an ally and a champion to help drive the CMO's agenda.
Thank you very much, Kim and Ryan. Appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, and we very much enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks a bunch.
Thank you.